Well, I've been looking forward to this day when I could come and be with you fine people here at Murray. Richard asked me to do this some time ago, and I've been looking forward to it ever since. I've known Richard and Pat for a good many years now. I helped officiate at their wedding, and I have followed Richard through the years and have been proud of him. He is a fine man. But I don't tell Richard that. What I tell him is, I don't even want to see you if you don't have Pat with you. But he is a fine man, and I'm sure that he has done a good job here at Murray First. I have already seen some people who were students of mine, some from Lambeth University, where I taught for 32 years, but also some from UT Martin. I was there before I went to Lambeth, and I was there for 5.5 years, and I saw some people from there also. So that certainly has added to the joy that I have had in coming here. Between these two services, I was privileged to go to Sunday school class and to hear Patricia lead the class in a very fine Sunday school lesson. So I have already been blessed many times in being here. And incidentally, I'd like to take this choir home with me. My goodness, beautiful, beautiful job, and I thank you so much for that. In the story that we read from Luke's Gospel a while ago, Jesus is teaching beside the Lake of Gennesaret, or as Matthew and Mark refer to that body of water, the Sea of Galilee. It apparently was early in the morning, and yet already there was a crowd that had come to hear Jesus teach. In fact, the crowd had grown so large, and they were pressing in on Jesus to such an extent that he found it necessary to step offshore and get into a boat. And you remember from the reading of the scripture and also from Kristen's lesson, didn't she do a beautiful job? And they caught quite a few fish. I don't know that sunk the boat, but they caught some fish there. But you remember from the reading of the scripture that the boat that Jesus stepped into was the one that belonged to Simon, who would later be renamed as Peter. Now, that raises a question for me, and that question is this: did Jesus purposely get in the boat that Simon owned, or did he just happen to step into a boat and that boat was the one Simon owned? The scripture doesn't tell us, but I have an idea that Jesus had his eye on Simon Peter ever since that day that he had healed Simon's mother-in-law in Capernaum, a story that we're told about in the preceding chapter. I think Simon Peter was awestruck with Jesus that day, and I think Jesus, in looking at him, could see that there was something special about him. And I think Jesus stepped into Simon's boat on purpose that day. Well, Simon was not in too good a mood probably that day that Jesus got into his boat. He was tired. He had been fishing all night long, and he had not caught a single fish. Now, I've never fished all night long, and I've never fished by throwing in the nets. But I can imagine that would get rather tiring after a while, especially if you did not catch a single fish. And even more especially if you're not fishing for recreation, but because you need the food. So Simon probably was not in too good a mood that day. And I can just envision him maybe as being very reluctant when Jesus asked him to move out a few feet from the shore so that I can teach from here. I can almost see Simon rolling his eyes and saying, "This is not a good time, Jesus." But he did as Jesus requested. And Jesus sat down and continued to teach the people. Now, Luke doesn't tell us what Jesus taught the people that day, but that doesn't really matter, because what's important in this story is what Jesus said to Simon. After he had finished instructing the people, he turned to Simon and said, "Push out into the deep water and lower your nets for a catch." And Simon, you remember, protested. "Master," he said, or at least that's what he said in our English translations. I looked in every translation I have of the New Testament at home, and in every single one of them, Peter called Jesus Master at this point. But at this point, Peter was not a disciple of Jesus, and we would not expect him to call Jesus Master. And as a matter of fact, he didn't. The Greek word that is used there is epistata. And epistata does not mean master in the sense of someone who has authority over you. Rather, it is a term of respect, perhaps like our English word, sir. And Peter then said to Jesus, "Sir, we have fished all night long and have caught nothing." And then, perhaps remembering the healing of his mother-in-law, he said, "But if you say so, I will push out into the deep water." Now, Simon, you see, was a seasoned fisherman. He knew how to catch fish. He thought there were none there to catch, but he did as Jesus requested. And he caught so many fish that he and his partner, and we assume that partner was his brother Andrew, although Andrew is not really mentioned in this story by name, but the two of them call out to James and John in the other boat for them to bring their boat over so that they could load up their boat with fish as well. Both boats got full of fish to such an extent that they were beginning to sink. At that point, Peter is just overwhelmed, and he falls to his knees and says, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." And yes, here indeed he does call Jesus Lord. Peter had learned something new about Jesus in this experience. He called Jesus Lord. And it was then, you see, that Jesus called him when Peter was ready to hear. Jesus called him to be one of his disciples. "Do not be afraid," he said. "From now on, you will be catching people." Now, Jesus' words were not intended for Simon alone. All four of those fishermen had been awed by what Jesus had just done, and they all four became disciples of Jesus. But Jesus' words were not just for those four fishermen either. His words have traveled down through the centuries, and Jesus speaks to us today and calls us, just as he called them back then, and says, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you and I will be catching people." But you may say, "Jesus, I'm not a preacher. I'm not an evangelist. No, but neither were Peter and his comrades. I believe that Jesus is calling each one of us this morning to be his disciple, to go out and to catch people. And I also believe that if we faithfully follow what Jesus has for us, that we too will be catching people, perhaps sometime when we don't even realize that's what we've been doing. I'm reminded of a story told by Alexander White, the great rector at St. George's Cathedral in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was there during the latter part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. And he told the story about a businessman named Rigby. Rigby's business brought him to Edinburgh rather frequently, and when he was there on a Sunday, he always went to St. George's Cathedral to hear Reverend White preach. But he made a point of it never to go alone. He always invited somebody to go with him. A friend, perhaps, or a stranger. One day, he invited a man to go with him, and the man refused. But Rigby would not give up, and he kept insisting until finally the man said, "Okay, I'll go." And they went, and the man received such a blessing that morning that he decided he would go back that evening and hear Reverend White preach again. And during that evening service, he, like John Wesley before him, felt his heart strangely warmed. And he told Rigby that his life had been changed because of his experience that day. From now on, he vowed, my life is going to be different. Rigby was so excited about that the next day he went to see Reverend White to tell him that story. And after he told him that story, Alexander White said to him, "What did you say your name is?" "My name is Rigby." "Oh," he said, "I am so glad to meet you." And he gathered up a pile of letters that he had saved over the years. And he said, every one of these letters is from someone who said, I first came to St. George's Cathedral because a man named Rigby had invited me to go. And he said 12 of these people have now surrendered their lives to Christ, and 4 of them are serving as rectors in churches. Rigby had been a fisher of people, and without even realizing it, he had caught 12. And of those 12, 4 had given their lives to the ministry. And what I'm saying to us this morning is that we can do that same thing. All we have to do is to share the good news.